We're just going to get started. I know we are competing against some other heavy hitters tonight in terms of public meetings with a Natick Select Board, Planning Board, and CPA focus group happening tonight, but we appreciate you guys for joining us. The recording of this meeting, as well as the Spanish and Portuguese audio of the meetings, will be available following the meeting, as well as the slide deck. So if folks weren't able to join us tonight, they'll be able to check in and catch up on what we talked about. And there's a follow-up feedback survey that'll be available as well for folks to give a little bit of additional feedback on what they heard this evening. I think we're going to kick start it off. Next slide, Kylie.
All right, and as Claire said, this will be translated. So if anyone needs the Spanish or Portuguese interpretation, the way you opt in is just hit the three little dots on the More tab at the bottom. And then when you see that globe, that signifies the interpretation option, and you can opt into different audio channels. So we have Spanish and Portuguese, and like Claire said, they will be recorded. So if you think it would be helpful to share it with anyone, or if you want to listen to it back, we'll have it recorded in all three languages.
Great. As I said, thank you guys so much for joining us here. We're hoping to wrap up around 8 o'clock. We're gonna just run through some welcome introductions. I'll dive a little bit into the project background. Our partners at Weston Sampson will dive into a little bit more of the technical detail about our project components. We'll review some of the project next steps over the next 4 months, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Next slide. So just a quick introduction of our project team. We have 3 sort of groups on the call here with us tonight. We have the Town of Natick. My name is Claire Rundelli, and I'm the Conservation Agent and Environmental Planner for the town. Joining us here tonight, we also have Bill Spratt, Executive Director of Public Works and Facility, Bill McDowell, our Town Engineer, and John DiGiacomo, our Assistant Town Engineer. On the Weston Sampson side tonight, we have Alex Simpson, who's our Project Manager, and Janet Moonen. And from the Charles River Watershed Association, we have Carly Sherman joining us. Thank you, CRWA, for hosting us this evening on your Zoom. And next slide. Just a little bit of the project background. Charles River Watershed Association has been a really fantastic partner, not only on this phase of the project, but on the project's origins. So this area in Natick was selected for a priority site design, a concept design, as part of the Charles River Flood Model Project, which is an ongoing grant project that has been running for just about 5 years now at this point. The Town of Natick has served as the fiscal lead on this regional grant project in partnership with Charles River Watershed Association and approximately 20 other communities in the Charles River watershed. It's shifted in numbers throughout the years of the grant project, but this area was identified as an area that is subject to flooding currently and worsened flooding under future climate conditions. The Charles River Flood Model, which you can learn about more on the Town of Natick website, has provided the watershed with a lot of really interesting data about how our communities are going to be impacted by future storm events. And a big factor of that is flooding. I think we've seen a lot in the last couple of years how these intense and back-to-back storm events can really amplify the effects of maybe what has historically been more minor flooding. So we can see on the map here, it's the high school area. And what we're looking at is 2 screen grabs of the Charles River Flood Model that shows flooding depths between the 2-year storm event and the 100-year storm event. And if the animation works, Carly, if you hit next slide, will it change? Oh, look at that. So we can see the previous image that we saw was today's flooding depths. And what we see now on the screen is the flooding depths for the 100-year storm and the 2-year storm event in 2070. And that timeline seems really far off, but these changes happen on a nonlinear basis. We know that this is going to be potentially a regular occurrence of flooding in 2070, but we know now that this flooding is still possible. And so in looking at the depths, next slide, Carly. it may not seem like a really substantial change in flooding depths in the 100-year storm event, which is a storm that has a roughly 1% chance of happening in any individual year. We go from a 2-foot flood depth to a 3-foot flood depth. And that is the difference between the changing station and bathroom house at Memorial Beach being flooded and it being dry. So it doesn't seem like a huge change in depth, but when we look at our infrastructure and other factors, residential homes, roadways, bridges, culverts, even those small changes can have a really significant impact on that infrastructure. Next slide. Now, why was this area specifically chosen? Natick has so many water bodies in our community, all of which experience issues, flooding, water quality. Why did we choose this spot specifically? There were a couple of reasons that this area was selected by the flood model. And a lot of that had to do with the potential impacts that this area had on a sort of larger area of Natick. The first reason that this area is chosen is because it is within the Charles River watershed, which is obviously a limitation of the model that we've been working under, though there are several efforts by other communities and other watersheds to develop similar models for those water bodies. We looked at this area because we saw an opportunity to improve the flooding situation on a real world scale. You can see that this watershed stretches on the southwest side, roughly about halfway down Route 27, right before Rockland Street, just about. And it stretches then all the way up and all the way back to Marion Street, just past Natick Center, and that large wetland system that sits behind the Community Senior Center. So, you know, upwards of 150 acres of watershed is draining to this singular point in town at this settling pond at Doug Pond. And there's obviously going to be some water that, you know, runs off in other places, ends up puddling in folks' backyards. But generally, all the water that's hitting our streets within this watershed is ending up in this small little settling pond. Next slide. So if folks are familiar, you're driving down West Street, it turns into Campus Drive, and you notice there's a little sort of gravel parking pull-off just on your right, and there's maybe a gross looking little pond that you see right there. And that is what we're referring to when we refer to settling pond. So this area, it wasn't necessarily designed for that purpose, but it has become almost a de facto area where water has an opportunity to sit before going under Campus Drive into Doug Pond. We've got 4 major project components. The primary one is designing a stormwater treatment feature at the settling pond and facilities yard that provides not only water quality benefits, but flooding mitigation and improved native vegetation. We also understand that one treatment feature at this singular location is probably not going to address the problem as a whole. So we are also taking a look at that large watershed that we just showed on the prior map to see where there are other opportunities in that watershed to provide additional infrastructure improvements, be they green or gray infrastructure. So at the settling pond, we're really focusing on green infrastructure, not only because of the water quality benefits that it provides along with flood mitigation, but also because we are very aware that this location is in close proximity to the high school and has an opportunity to potentially provide educational opportunities to the students as well. But throughout the watershed as a whole, where space is potentially more of a constraint, there's existing infrastructure, roadways, all of these competing factors, we are also taking into account gray infrastructure to be able to fit improvements into our existing system. Next slide. Part 3 is an evaluation of that existing settling pond. Folks who may have been in town for a while, I heard this first from David Ordway on the Open Space Advisory Committee that pond was dredged back in the 80s. All the sediment was removed from it. And as ponds naturally do, especially ponds that receive this volume of stormwater runoff, a lot of that sediment has returned to the pond. You know, erosion from folks' yards, sediment and debris like sand that's put down for salt or for ice management. all that sediment gets washed into our storm drains and gets carried to this point. And so there's quite a bit of sediment in this existing pond. Not during the drought last year, but the drought year of 2022, you could almost walk across it. It was so dry out there. It looked more like a mud flat than anything. And so we're going to be assessing that pond for dredging opportunities in the future. Dredging is a very expensive and permit heavy process to go through. So we really want to make sure that the town is fully understanding the feasibility of that dredging. So that way we can make the most appropriate decisions on how to address the sediment that's ended up in the pond. And finally, part of what we're doing here tonight, part 4 of our project is outreach and engagement. We're hoping to present to the public in a variety of formats and provide education on green infrastructure installation and maintenance to our internal staff as well. So we started our process off with a Coffee with the Purpose presentation. It's available on their YouTube page if you'd like to watch it. We're having this meeting here tonight, which will be recorded and made available. We also had a community survey that went out that's going to help inform those watershed concepts in the future. Next slide, Carly. So just a little bit of that timeline for the project. Right now, we're sitting at February 2025 for our virtual public meeting. In March, we're going to be presenting to the Natick High School Earth Club and any other students or staff who are interested in the project. In April, we're going to do the pond bathymetry work, which is that study of the existing pond in terms of soils, depths, and we're going to be working on those internal trainings. Other opportunities for you guys to join us on this project. We're going to be hosting a public walk on May 3rd from 1 to 3 p.m. And that walk will take us a little bit through that watershed that I showed you. So that way folks can have an opportunity to really see where the water is coming from that's ending up in this pond. And then we'll have an in-person public meeting on May 20th. Location and time to be finalized. And then our project will complete at the end of June of this year. We have a 1 fiscal year grant from the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. We're really lucky as a town to have benefited from a number of MVP grants. And we really are excited for this opportunity to move forward from the sort of concept design of the project, which was also funded through an MVP grant, to this permit ready design phase of the project. Next slide. Back one more. Oh, there you go. So just a little bit about why this project is important. I talked a little bit about why this area was chosen, but specifically, why is this project that we're working on, you know, these staff hours, these grant dollars, why are we spending it on this project? And there's a couple of really important reasons. The first is that we've heard feedback from the public. As a part of a number of other grant projects and community engagement efforts, we have heard from the town that access to public swimming locations and pooling locations is not accessible enough because we're seeing frequent closures, not only at Chitchwit State Park, but also at Doug Pond because of algal blooms creating toxic conditions. So we're looking to design a treatment feature that will help remove nutrients and sediment from the water entering Doug Pond. And those larger watershed concepts will also hopefully focus on water quality improvements to improve the water quality and hopefully reduce instances of algal blooms. We also have a required town action. There's a state permit called the MS4 permit. I'm not going to say what all the S's are because I always mess one of them up, but you can absolutely Google it if you'd like. But it's essentially focused on ensuring that the town's sewer management and the stormwater management remain separate and distinct. And there's also certain requirements on the town as part of being part of the Charles River watershed. We have a total daily maximum load, TMDL, that's for phosphorus in the Charles River. And so the town is required to remove certain pounds of phosphorus from the watershed over the years of the permit. So, as I mentioned, we're focusing on that removal of nutrients as well as flood mitigation. Next slide. And finally, we know that climate change is here, and we know that it's probably going to get worse. And so we're seeing more intense storms, more frequent storms, and larger precipitation volumes. And so we're designing this feature to be able to handle those changing climate conditions. The little graphic on the screen here, this is all data from NOAA. But in 1964, the 100-year storm over a 2-day period was estimated at roughly 8.5 inches. And today, in 2024, the 100-year storm total over a 2-day period was predicted to be up to 12.2 inches. So that's 4 more inches of rain in a 2-day period. And if folks remember 2023, when we had 2 4-inch storms back to back in December, that's a lot of water coming down. And so it's, again, it seems like small numbers, but when you think about it in that larger context, it has really substantial impacts. Next slide. And here I'm going to turn it over to our partners at Weston Sampson, Alex Simpson, to get into a little bit more of the technical details about our project components.
Thanks, Claire. So now we're going to talk through some of, the components of the project itself, talking through the actual kind of design pieces that we're working through. And so to start with, we're going to talk through, the design of that stormwater feature that Claire had mentioned at Doug Pond and near the high school. Next slide, please. So before we get into what we're thinking for, the design, we want to talk through kind of what do these different components of the system actually mean? And so when we're talking about gray infrastructure, we're talking of, what's that journey of the water going through the gray system? And so that's, the water is picking up pollutants on the ground. So, we have these rain events, it rains, it hits the ground, and then it hits the road typically or some other surface. And then it kind of runs downhill, so to speak. And then it enters into what we call our gray infrastructure system, typically at, a curb grate or a catch basin. You'll hear it called a couple different things, but, it hits that system and then it kind of goes down in there and it enters, kind of that structure, and then it goes into the pipe. And then that system kind of filters down through the watershed and ends up at Doug Pond in this case for this project. And so, when you're walking around Natick, like what you're going to be seeing on the road now is all these catch basins, and that's all interconnected for, the gray infrastructure system. But the real takeaway here is that, the water is hitting that ground, it's picking up whatever is there, but there's no treatment being kind of done to that water as it goes into the system. And so when it hits Doug Pond and that settling pond, that's when we can have some of the issues Claire mentioned. Next slide, please. And so what can we do instead of only relying on gray infrastructure? And that's when we look at green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And I know there's a lot of text here, but really what you need to know is that green infrastructure kind of involves treatment of that stormwater. And so it's how do we kind of infiltrate, which means we have that water going back into the ground, back into that system, and how do we kind of clean it up before it gets discharged back into Doug Pond for this case. And so we're looking at a couple different types of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions for this project. And so we'll show you some of those options we're looking at in the next slide. Oh, sorry. And so, like I said before, the benefits of the green infrastructure is we get that flood reduction, we get water quality improvements, we get urban heat island reduction. So, if you're not familiar with that, if you're on, a paved road with no shade, think about how hot that is. Whereas, when you're in the grass, it's much cooler, it's much more refreshing. And so if we can incorporate these systems that have some of those green spaces, but are also giving us that water quality, we can have that co-benefit of that heat island reduction. We get ecological habitat. So having more grass, more plants, bushes, trees, that brings pollinators, that brings animals and bugs and everything else. And so that kind of increases the ecological diversity in, these more paved settings. Maintenance reduction, when you think of the gray infrastructure, that catch basin I was just talking about, that needs to be maintained. And so some of that sediment that kind of gets picked up on the road that goes down into that system, how do we maintain that? And when you do these green infrastructure systems, often some of that sediment can get filtered out before it goes into that gray infrastructure kind of system, and that can be a net positive. And also just, can increase property values. If you see just a paved road with no green space, that's kind of not as attractive all the time. And so having these green spaces intermingled within your community can really just make it nicer. So there's a lot of co-benefits that can be involved by choosing these types of systems versus kind of the traditional gray infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so, all this is to say is we're looking at doing these types of green infrastructure systems at the Natick High School, specifically at that facilities yard that you can see called out below. So to the southeast here, just north of the facilities yard, there is an outlet that Claire was talking about previously, and that discharges all of that water that's in that gray infrastructure system right into the settling pond. And like Claire said, this has been dredged before. It gets a lot of sediment. It's getting a lot of material kind of brought into here. And so we're looking at how can we intercept some of that water and actually treat it so it can be cleaner as it goes into that settling pond, which then goes into duck pond, which can then have all these like other positive effects. So this picture is just so you can kind of see everything in relation to itself. But if you go to the next slide, please. Yes. So we're looking at a couple different options, like I said, and so we just want everyone to be familiar with kind of what we're thinking and what some of the options are, so we can have that conversation started if people do have a preference or want to talk about it more. So the first kind of option we're looking at in the toolbox is a bioretention area or a rain garden. And you can see here in these pictures, the top picture is one that was just constructed. There's no water in it. And then, below is that same feature, but filled with water during the rain event. And like Claire said, you don't think these water volumes are that much. You don't think it's that much volume, but then you can see here, all of that water would just be spread out everywhere else if it wasn't collected in this basin. And so on a larger scale, you can see how that has that net effect of kind of capturing that water and reducing some of these flooding effects that we're going to potentially see. But some of the key things about the bioretention area is that it's directed into this basin. It's a surface feature. It's a depression. It's typically filled with plants, pollinators, so increasing that biodiversity. And underneath, there's actually a whole system of amended soils and other features that take that water, increase that storage, and allow some of that storm event to get captured on site before it goes into the gray infrastructure system. So we do have a detail, but feel free to ignore it if you don't like it. Next slide, please. So the next one is a constructed stormwater wetland. And so these can take many shapes and forms. Different communities have installed them, super effectively. You might have heard of the Alewife stormwater wetland or the Reading constructed wetland. So those are just some kind of more local Massachusetts options. But really what a wetland does is it's a large area that can capture a lot of water and provide a lot of treatment. And so it's trying to replicate what we see out in nature, which is a typical wetland, just we're constructing it here for stormwater kind of mitigation. And so you have shallow pools, you have a lot of plants, you're trying to replicate the natural environment, and you're just capturing that water, allowing it to meander through, filter through in the different pools or plants, and then eventually it will outlet back into the settling pond. But you've effectively slowed it down and added a lot of kind of time before it kind of hits the settling pond. And so that's kind of the benefit of a constructed stormwater wetland. Next slide, please. And so we've talked about these two different kinds of green infrastructure, but there's not just the kinds, there's also the scale. And the scale really can change what you're doing with the green infrastructure. And so we just want everyone to know what that can look like at different scales, because it can be very different than what you're expecting. And so for a small scale green infrastructure, we're talking, typically in the right of way, typically smaller and more compact footprint. And so you can see some of the examples below, but we're talking under 20 feet wide with a variable length, just kind of put where we can fit it. And so this is what some of those solutions can look like. Next slide, please. And then on the other side of it is we have these large scale green infrastructure systems. And, a lot of times people see these and they don't even understand that this is actually a stormwater feature. And this is doing a lot of work to help improve your water quality. And so these are another one of the options we're looking at is how big of a practice can we install at this location to try to capture as much water as possible and provide the most benefit. So you can see here on the left, this is from Fitchburg Hospital. It's a huge kind of detention basin, and it's depressed down. It can outlet with a pipe. And then on the right, this is actually a gravel wetland with all the plants kind of coming through on top. And so it just looks like a meadow area, but it's actually doing a lot of treatment and a lot of good for the contributing area for capturing that water before it outlets to the river below. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass it over to Jenny now that we've kind of gone through some of the ideas we're looking at the settling pond, but we're still working through that process. So if you do have any feedback or any thoughts, like definitely let us know.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Moonen from Weston Sampson. I'm a senior project manager and supporting Alex with design on this effort and coordinating with our modeling team. So I'm going to cover how we're assessing the watershed beyond the specific area right around the high school and thinking about that larger watershed. So next slide. We have been doing quite a bit of data gathering. It's so important to get this information in person and directly from folks that are, living through experiencing storm events in Natick. So we've had a visit to the site specifically and walked around the watershed area that Claire had showed on a previous slide. We completed what's called test pitting, and that's really where we're looking at what are the subsurface soil conditions and how favorable are they to us putting water back into the ground, right? Alex was talking about infiltration. How much can we do there? And we did that around specifically the facility site at the high school. We didn't do that throughout the whole watershed, just the high school so far. And we've really gotten quite a bit of feedback from the public as well as DPW and facilities on where the town has experienced flooding throughout the watershed. Next slide. What we've done is worked towards developing a hydrologic and hydraulic model of this watershed. And so what we're doing with that is we're using mapped information from the town of Natick, and that includes the stormwater system, right? So where are catch basins, where are drain manholes, how are the pipes connected, how big are they? We're also using that Charles River watershed model that Claire mentioned, and that was a bigger project that's ongoing and is benefiting many communities across the watershed. We also have gone out into this area and looked at a number of critical locations where we really needed to understand what was going on with elevations, what was going on with connectivity, and take measurements. And we've used LiDAR, and for those that aren't familiar with LiDAR, it stands for light detection and ranging. Basically, it's a simplistic way, a phrase you will use when people talk about topography or elevation or contours. So we're just understanding what is the elevation of the surface, how does water flow uphill, downhill, and where are the uphill locations. So we're combining that information into our process. Next slide. And all of that goes into the one-dimensional model development. And the one-dimensional model is reflecting, right, all of the pieces of where does water fall and flow. You can see on the left side of this slide the various model elements. I'm not going to read all of the components, but what we've done is done a very discrete and thoughtful process to understand connectivity of water and to Doug Pond and where those problems might be so that problems that are reported are and where potential future problems might be from additional precipitation due to climate change. Next slide. And then we develop what's called a two-dimensional model. And this, the best way to think of this is it's helping understand where does it flood? How far does the flooding go? How deep is the flooding? It's showing where does water kind of puddle and store? Where is water flowing into that pipe system that was on the previous slide? And it's really helping the town understand, what does this look like dynamically when you have different storm events? So that is really, honing in and being able to focus on specific areas and answer questions about that dynamic flooding. Next slide. So far we have run multiple storms through the model. And what you're seeing on this are preliminary results that have come out before we've completed what's called calibration. And that's where we're comparing our results to what the town staff have observed and what the public has reported. But the image on the left is a zoom in. And what it's showing you is this is where we anticipate flooding under baseline conditions, which are, we are typically looking at a 24-hour storm that's a 10-year recurrence, which means on average, I'm going to do it simply, but on average, that storm would happen once every 10 years. And a 24-hour storm is that it would rain for, a full day. And the colors that are in like purples and blues and greens, that's anticipated flooding under a current storm around, a present day storm. And then anything shown in orange or red, that's anticipated flooding in the year 2070 based on future precipitation values. And we get those future precipitation values from guidance from from Massachusetts. So the Commonwealth has adopted recommended future storm numbers. But so you can see visually what this model looks like, right? Where the rain, where the flooding is, how far it goes, who it might impact, etc. Next slide. We're undertaking a whole assessment of the watershed to identify where we can employ nature-based solutions in conjunction with gray solutions, as Alex and Claire had talked about. And there's a multi-step process here. We're looking at plans, reports, understanding capital projects, around sidewalks and roadways, redevelopments. We're looking at the data that we've organized and reports, the model results. We're thinking about topography and the existing drainage infrastructure and parcel ownership, and thinking about where is best to put these nature-based solutions or green infrastructure practices, trying to size those for the location that we're installing, and making them be, practical and buildable, not take up parking or space that's necessary for the community. We're thinking about, how are they constructible? Are they feasible? And we will be working through a process with the town to prioritize those locations. And one of those pieces will be on how well they do to reduce flood reduction, how well they reduce pollution, how feasible are they to care for or maintain, and also, the co-benefits that Alex talked about. Next slide. Our overarching goals of this watershed assessment are to think about the biggest projects and the most bang for the buck, right? We want to be cost effective for Natick and have practices that are going to help reduce flooding and reduce pollution runoff. We're also going to identify those small and medium scale projects, though, that really can be part of longer term planning or integrate into roadway work. But really, like I said, we want to be able to build these. We want them to be fundable. It's challenging as a community to get enough money for these, and there are grants that are available. So we're trying to make these as competitive as possible. And we are thinking about all those co-benefits to the community, to the ecosystem, and to the climate, mitigating climate. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Alex.
Thanks, Jenny. So the next part of this is looking at, the existing settling pond. So we've talked through the stormwater treatment option at the high school near the facilities yard that will ultimately feed into that settling pond, we've talked about some of that mitigation and interventions that we can do kind of upstream in the watershed to reduce what is coming into the settling pond. But now the next phase of work is also looking at how do we evaluate that existing settling pond and what does that look like? Next slide, please. And so to do that, we're first going to just kind of look at it and review that existing pond. So we're going to be looking at, you know, the bathymetry and the soils. And for anyone that's not familiar, bathymetry is essentially those contours in that LiDAR that Jenny was talking about. We're looking at that under the surface of the water. And so what does the bottom of that settling pond look like when it's totally dry? So if you happen to be around during the drought, you might have gotten a glimpse of what some of that bathymetry actually looks like. And so the first step is just understanding what does the underlying surface look like here, and how does that compare to what it used to look like, or what does that look like, you know, post dredging in the 80s. And so kind of understanding what does that bottom of the pond look like. And then we're also looking at the soils. So is there contamination? What type of soil is it? Is it super compacted? Is it full of organics? Just what is the composition of that soil that is kind of at the bottom of that settling pond? And on top of just looking at what it is, we're also looking at the volume and the quality. So like, how much do we have of these different soils and anything else that happens to be at the bottom of the pond, and what's the quality? So like I said, when we're looking at the soils, we're looking at, is it good to have? Is it supporting what it needs to do? Or is there an option to kind of do something better here? And so that's kind of the first phase of looking at this settling pond. Next slide, please. And then ultimately, you know, based on kind of the historic use of this pond or historic kind of treatment and what could be done here, we are looking at the feasibility of dredging that pond so we can have that be part of future phases to create additional storage. And so in the previous slide, I talked about let's look at what's underneath the water and see how much soil we have and see what kind of quality it is. And so say that comes back inopportune, let's say, so what's that next phase? And that could be potentially dredging the pond. And so part of that phase of work is we're just going to see, can we do this in this current kind of condition, and what would that look like, and how much storage could we actually get by doing that? And here's an example of, you know, a dredge operation happening. And so it would just be kind of scooping out that soil, relocating it, and creating that storage that way. Next slide, please. And so those are kind of the design phases of the project. We've talked through kind of all three of those. And so what are the next steps? Claire's talked about this is an MVP project. So we are trying to finish by June 30th per the grant. And so, you know, before that happens, we are going to be calibrating our model, you know, based on the different flooding areas that we've gotten, the survey results. So thank you everyone that did do that, because that's super helpful for us, making the model be as accurate as possible. We're going to be doing the GSI screening that Jenny talked about. So we're going to be reviewing the watershed, seeing what we can put there and seeing what kind of benefit it can get. And then we'll be looking at the stormwater treatment design at the facilities yard, like we talked about. And so we're waiting on survey. Once we get that, we'll be working through what does that design look like? What can we actually do here? And how much treatment can we get? Because ultimately that's what we're trying to maximize. And then finally, like I just said, you know, the evaluation of the existing settling pond. Can dredging be done here? Is that a good option? And what would that look like? So that's all to come. And, you know, Claire's going to talk later on more touch points on how to get involved in these next phases. So that's it for the design, and I'll pass it off to Claire.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about how you all can really have an impact on this project. We really strive when we're designing these kinds of features to really engage with the public, because we know a lot of these, you know, terms, green stormwater infrastructure, sustainability, and it can be hard to justify why these things are important to our community. But we hope that tonight's presentation has really demonstrated to you all the sort of larger scale view that we're trying to apply to this project, and how we really hope that it is not going to only improve Natick and Natick as a community, but also the Charles River watershed as a whole, even on a small scale. Next slide, Carly. So community engagement, Alex mentioned the survey responses. We did have 58 survey responses. Thank you to all the public participants who were involved. And we really, the full calibration hasn't been completed yet, but some of the responses we weren't super surprised by, which I think was really great sort of confirmation that we were seeing things that needed to be addressed in certain areas of the community. I think one area that really stood out to me is the Presidential's neighborhood, for folks who are familiar with that, the neighborhood behind Town Hall, where there's a lot of built infrastructure. There's not a lot of lawn space. There's a lot of roofs. There's a lot of active construction projects, resulting in maybe what green space there was now being disturbed during active construction. And so all of those things have had an impact on the stormwater management in the area, because we think about when those pipes and those catch basins went in the ground, and those systems were being designed in the 70s and 80s, and maybe not having that climate lens on, as is more common today. And so now we're seeing, 1964, 8.5 inches, 2024, 12.2 inches. Are those systems really able to capture that additional water in an effective manner? And I think winter of 2023 was a great example of that. Big storms, back-to-back storms, cold weather temperatures, meaning frozen ground conditions. We saw a lot of roadway flooding, and maybe it was only a couple of hours before it dissipated and drawed down into those catch basins. But I saw substantial impacts from that flooding. There were down gradient properties impacted. The trails at Coolidge Hill were severely eroded. So it's not just residential impacts, it's larger community impacts. And we should have a full report on the survey results available on the website once all of that data has finished being compiled. We have a public meeting here tonight. As I mentioned on the timeline earlier, we are also going to have another public meeting on May 20th, likely starting at 6:30 p.m. We're still working on finalizing a location for that in-person meeting, but we are aiming to have that meeting be in person to really engage with you guys. The school engagement, we are going to be presenting to the Earth Club, who's been a really great partner on a number of other projects that the town has been involved in, as well as other interested students and staff. And we also see an opportunity here, like I said, for education, with the tiny forest going in at the high school in the fall of 2023, the existing bioretention areas that were designed as a part of the high school site when it was being constructed back in 2012. And now this feature, we have a real opportunity to create some effective outdoor classrooms for our students. And so working with the school admin and science staff on potential ways to adapt these features into the curriculum that the schools are teaching. And if you guys are interested in joining us on a lovely roughly 2-mile walk, we're going to be doing a walk with Charles River Watershed Association in partnership again on the Earth Day All Around Natick weekend that has been hosted for the last few years. The walk is going to be on Saturday, May 3rd at 1 p.m. And we will be meeting at 1 South Main Street, right on the corner there, right next to the beautiful stormwater mural that says, "This close to Doug Pond." And we are going to follow those pipes and catch basins through the watershed to the project location and then back up to the Natick Center, so that folks can really get a picture of the challenges that the project is facing in terms of where can we really fit this necessary infrastructure improvement. Next slide. And so next steps. And we'll have some time for questions if folks have any questions, but keep an eye out on the project webpage. We are working to update it as regularly as we get new materials. The slide deck from tonight's presentation, as well as the recordings, will all be linked and available on the webpage, as well as a feedback survey. It is a very brief survey, 5 to 10 minutes at most. But we know that we've maybe thrown some information at you guys at at you guys tonight. And we're hoping that maybe even if you don't have any questions or feedback right now in this moment, that maybe as you continue to think on it, or if there are folks who can't join us here tonight, they still have a way to provide feedback. And then finally, we do have a direct email update list. Please do reach out to me. My email is there on the screen. It's also plastered all over the Natick website if you go to the Conservation Commission web pages. Please email me and I will be happy to email you direct updates about the project. So that way, if the website's being updated, you're probably getting an email about it from me. We really, really want to engage with the public on this project because we, again, see a real community benefit from this type of work. And we hope that this project serves as almost a replicable model for some of the other areas in town that are really in need of similar levels of planning. We're very aware that there are a number of water bodies in Natick that need help. They are stressed, they are overtaxed, they are culverted, and we see how those historic sort of lack of forward thinking is really impacting us today in a day where our funding is, I feel like, even more limited than in years past, with the constraints on some grant funding on the federal level, as well as obviously Natick is coming up on an override vote. I'm not going to dance around the subject, but funding is definitely a key piece of this puzzle. And as Jenny said, we really do design these projects to be as competitive as possible, so that way we can rely on grant funding to really support this important work, and not necessarily take any dollars away from Bill and John and their very necessary roadway improvement plan. So with that, next slide. I think we are a little ahead of schedule, but here again are some contact informations for folks related to the project. And if there's any questions at this point in time, I know we don't have a ton of folks on tonight, so honestly, feel free to unmute yourself and let us know if you have any questions or comments. I know Jenny threw some great links in the chat. And if there are, again, any questions that come up after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out.
How do I ask a question?
Oh, feel free, Greg.
Two quick questions. It doesn't look like you've included Pig Pond, if you know which one that is, which is very near Doug Pond,
Okay.
In terms of its water quality. Has any of the project looked at Pig Pond, and do you know where it is, what I'm talking about?
Yes, Greg, I believe you're referring to the small pond that's right behind the baseball field parking lot, just down
Yeah.
West Street.
Yeah, there's a lot of debris in there, and it should be cleaned out and help for its water quality. If that can be part of the project to look at that, it's a nice wildlife pond if it's taken care of. The other thing is, Doug Pond is not a closed system. I believe it outflows through the former dump and eventually into the Charles River. Is anything being done about the concern of the quality of the water that goes out of Doug Pond and eventually works its way into the Charles because of the problem of the dump leaching bad things into the water? I don't know if that should be part of the project. Do you think Charles River Associates or whatever would be concerned with that? Has anyone thought of the outflow of Doug Pond as part of the project?
Greg, I'll jump on and address your first question first. So we are working with DPW and facilities, as well as some of the great volunteer groups in Natick, to schedule a cleanup at Pig Pond, hopefully this spring. We are definitely aware of a lot of the issues that water body faces. That pond is actually an isolated wetland. So the water that flows into that pond, it really does get trapped there, except for when it reaches its limits and overflows. And so we're not necessarily looking at that water body as part of this project specifically, but there are definitely opportunities for improvement in that area as well that the town is aware of and exploring. And in regard to the outflow, the town does do quite a bit of monitoring in relation to the landfill. It's required by several other regulatory agencies. So there is a company that the town hires to monitor not only the air quality, but I believe the groundwater quality in the area as well, to ensure that the landfill is meeting all of the required state standards. So while we aren't looking at that specifically as a part of this project, the outflow is a part of the sort of larger watershed. So we are looking at that as part of the larger Charles River flood model project. In fact, Sherburne is also our partner on that larger project, where Indian Brook flows through before it hits the Charles River. So there's definitely eyes in that area as well, though maybe not as part of this specific project.
Yeah, thank you. That I was always hoping the outflow from Doug Pond could be diverted away from the mitigate getting involved with the dump water as it flows out, but it would take a lot of engineering to do that, I'm sure. Yeah, thanks. Pig Pond's a little pet project of mine to try to improve. We used to have a lot of peepers there and all sorts of things, and it's gotten hurt over the years. Thank
Yes,
you.
Pat Conway and I have been talking about it recently, so hopefully there'll be some news about an opportunity in the future on that.
Thanks.